Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about Golden Age detective fiction. The First World War had an enormous impact on North America and Europe, as well as other parts of the world. And, the world had changed. People were scared. There is nothing like being terrified for people to want to return to the quote-unquote good old days. Whenever people are scared, it's natural to reimagine the past as this sort of glorified entity that never really existed, but that they think existed. This is the same argument you could have any day at the dinner table with any older family member who's convinced that the 1950s was a much better time. For certain things, it was. For great hairdos, the 1950s were a fantastic time. However, for women's rights, gay rights, half another dozen rights, not a great time, and frankly, although the music was great, I would much rather be born in the era that I was born rather than back then, simply because times have changed, and I kind of think that they've changed for the better in some respects. So, we have a Europe and a North America who are kind of in shock after World War I. They really don't know what to make of everything, so why not just escape into fiction? Golden Age detective fiction is well known for taking place in large mansions amongst the upper class or these idealistic villages where, yes, some people are hiding secrets, but other than that, the world is this kind of idealistic place where the sun always shines and the lovers always get married and the divorcees sometimes even reconcile. Despite some of the novels being written prior to the war, the Golden Age really began in the 1920s. However, as the 1920s turned into the 1930s and the Great Depression hit the world, people stopped wanting to have all this wealth flaunted in their face, and instead, it slowly turned into what we now know as hard-boiled detective fiction in the 1940s. Golden Age is what it says on the tin. It's a golden age. This is the era of Agatha Christie, of Miss Marple, of Poirot, all these glorious detectives who are morally upstanding individuals, who freely visit all these magnificent places across Europe and sometimes across America, depending on the author, and who always solve everything. Everything in the world is perfectly fine once they have solved the mystery. There is no more problems in the world once that one issue has been dealt with. Now, of course, that isn't realistic. However, in the world of fiction, it is exactly this kind of thing that people needed after the First World War, when everything was so uncertain. It was a perfect safe space. Some of the best known writers are, of course, Agatha Christie, G.K. Chesterton, and Dorothy L. Sayers. They are well known for their works, and even if you haven't heard of them directly, there are so many detective tropes that you see in CSI Miami or whatever garbage is passing for television these days that come straight from those writers. In 1929, Robert Knox wrote 10 rules of detective fiction to help people write good detective stories. Now, of course, these are just his rules. No one has to follow all the rules. However, they are very helpful for the beginner or for anyone trying to learn more about detective fiction to understand where people are coming from and why Knox insisted on these very specific rules. Number 1. The criminal must be mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be someone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to know. Number 2. All supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Number 3. No more than one secret room or passage is allowable. Number 4. No hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, nor any appliance which will need long scientific explanations at the end. Number 5. No Chinamen must figure in the story. Number 6. No accident must ever help the detective, nor must he ever have an unaccountable intuition which proves to be right. Number 7. The detective himself must not commit the crime. Number 8. The detective is bound to declare any clues which he may discover. Number 9. The sidekick or Watson of the story must not conceal from the reader any thoughts which pass through his mind. his intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly below that of the average reader. Number 10. Twin brothers and doubles are generally awful and must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. Now, as you know, you can probably imagine, well, first of all, you're probably thinking, what the heck is a Chinaman? And isn't that racist? We'll get to it. Let's focus first on a very famous exception of the narrator rule. Agatha Christie wrote a novel called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Now, skip a minute ahead if you don't want spoilers for this, nearly century-old novel. The murderer turns out to be the narrator, the Watson of the story. Poirot goes through the entire murder case trying to figure out who exactly is the killer when it turns out that the narrator is the killer. And that makes for a very interesting situation where the reader has been led to believe that they can trust the writer to show everything open and fairly. The idea is that you, the reader, you, the audience, are perfectly capable just of solving the mystery without having to have it spelt out for you. Now, obviously, you don't want to sit there and solve the mystery yourself. If you did, you would go out and get a job as an actual detective running around chasing people. But you don't. You want the Sherlock Holmes, you want the Poirot to explain everything to you. But you don't want to feel like you're stupid. So you need the mystery to make sense. Okay, other than spoilers for Roger Ackroyd, let's look at rules 1, 2, 4, and 10. They're very specifically meant to avoid having a story where the author cheats the reader out of a good mystery by making up some half-baked solution. And by that I mean, the author didn't try. They wanted a murder weapon, so they invented this new kind of lightsaber that makes no noise and is super deadly and can shrink to the size of a rat's fingernail. Now, how are you supposed to know that that exists? And if you don't know that it exists, you can't solve the mystery before the detective does. And technically, with all the hints and all the clues in the story, you should be able to solve the mystery right along with the Watson and the detective. You should be right there with them. You should be able to follow along. And having something appear out of nowhere doesn't really make sense and leaves you feeling like the author just cheated. Rules number 3 and 5 are meant to keep the story realistic. Now, the Chinaman rule very specifically refers to non-European, or really non-Western, sets of knowledge. So it's to avoid the author bringing in some mysterious thing from the Middle East that no one has ever seen and that totally kills people without leaving a trace, and instead focusing on something that you, the reader, might be aware of, so that when you're reading the story, you might be able to guess who the murderer is without feeling cheated at the end. Now, if the author or the writer decides to bring in some vaguely Chinese mafia who scale famous London buildings in a single bound and then break into bankers' offices and leave yellow spray paint marks everywhere, well, that is a Chinaman, literally, and I'm not here to talk about the implications of that racist trope. However, I am here to say that that is cheating. How am I supposed to know that the Chinese acrobats from this Chinese traditional circus are capable of climbing that building? I mean, it's just a glass egg, a giant glass egg. Going back to the issue at hand, Chinamen are a combination of racist tropes and just Westerners believing that anything that the Easterners do is weird voodoo magic. Again, rules 6, 7, 8, and 9 are meant to encourage the author to stick to a story that the audience, us, can follow along and solve without the detective telling us directly what the answer is. Rule number 9 is very specifically meant so that the Watson doesn't solve the mystery before the reader does. It's meant to make you, the reader, feel smarter, and it's meant to drag out the story so that when the detective gives you the solution, you already have a very good idea in your head of what is actually going on. I've read many, many detective stories, and I can tell you that the ones that made me mad were the ones that pulled a solution out of thin air. And the ones that I enjoyed the most were the ones that I could actually see, that I could follow through the logic, and okay, fine, maybe they're it's a bit odd, or maybe it's a little bit unbelievable, but that I am not pulled too far from reality in the story, and that I can still follow it, that there's no magical X-Men mind control stories. God, that's season 4 again. We don't talk about Sherlock season 4. That everything is rooted in reality, and that I, as a reader, don't have to start thinking that there's X-Men in our world to be able to solve the mystery. Okay, let's look at some tropes that are very well known from this era in literature. So, number 1. Have you ever heard the saying, the butler did it? That is Golden Age detectives. The whole thing about gathering everyone to give a great presentation about how the murder is solved isn't really seen in classical detective fiction. It is mostly seen in Golden Age detective fiction, and now it's basically a detective trope that everyone does. Of course, there's also the driven to suicide plotline, which very Golden Age, because then the detective doesn't have to be violent, and there's something... Golden Age detective fiction tends to be a little bit weird about suicide. It tends to view it as both good, very justified karma, and also kind of respectable in a way, simply because some of the higher class people who commit suicide kill themselves rather than go to prison with all the lower class people. And there's an essay to be written about that. However, here's not the time or the place. There is the trope of the narrator being the murderer, and that is from Agatha Christie. She's the one who really made that popular. And the ever so famous trope of the murderer requesting the detective's help. That it's not the victim that calls up and says, "Hey, Mr. Detective, come solve my mystery." No, it's the murderer that calls Miss Marple to try to distance themselves from the actual murder and make her think that they are innocent. This does happen in some classical detective stories. However, it is something that happens very often in Golden Age fiction. There are many other tropes that arise from this era, but one that's a well-known example, other than Roger Ackroyd, is the idea that Christie popularized, that something didn't happen that should have happened, which is something that happens a lot in her stories. But Conan Doyle did that first. He explored that in his story Silver Blaze, where the solution is revealed to be that Holmes notices that the dog didn't bark, and the dog would have barked if it was a stranger that caused the murder rather than someone the dog already knew. Christie is often the one who popularized certain tropes just because her stories are so well known, but it doesn't mean that she invented them, and she did borrow heavily from Conan Doyle's work. Obviously, I mean, who hasn't at this point? Some other detectives who you may or may not know from this era include Lord Peter Wimsey, Father Brown, Hercule Poirot, and Miss Marple. There are dozens of other detectives, but for the sake of keeping this video under an hour, I'm going to focus mostly on Christie's characters. The detectives of this era tend to be likable, well-dressed, well-spoken, and tend to be within all levels of society. Unlike Holmes, they tend to be less quirky, and they do not use drugs, like, no drugs, at all. They live in a world where there's a balance that must be maintained, and when it isn't, the detective comes in and restores it. And this balance is always perfectly natural. That the rich are rich, the poor are poor, the young are happy and married, and the old are happy or mourning the loss of their loved one. That there is this very peaceful, tranquil society that is very small town, cute village, but also big manor house, Downton Abbey. It is all very idealistic and heavily based on the British countryside, or at least the pastoral vision of the British countryside. Once again, I will insist that the romantic pastoral scenes of England never really existed. The landscapes are there, but the lies we tell ourselves that these people in these eras were happier than we were, not necessarily true. They had their own problems, like we have our own problems, and just because you think you would be happier herding sheep in 1604 doesn't mean you actually would be. Let's look at Hercule Poirot. He is definitely one of Christie's most famous creations. He comes across initially as short, fat, silly, But by the end of it, everyone knows that he's very clever, and his intuitiveness simply earns him the respect that he deserves. In Christie's story, The Orient Express, Poirot is stuck in essentially a locked room. It's not a room, it's a train, but essentially the same idea, where the murder happened on the train, and there is this set group of people on the train, and it must be one of them who committed the murder, because simply there is no one else. However, who did it? There are so many options that Poirot is forced to sit down and consider exactly what must have happened and whether or not he is able to pursue this through a criminal court. Christie makes a very interesting decision in The Orient Express. I won't spoil it for you because, well, you probably already know it, and if not, there's so many adaptations of this that I'm sure you can find one that you like. Poirot at the end is forced to keep silent simply due to just the people involved, just the sheer numbers of people and the people involved. He has to keep quiet, but also that the world would not be the same place if the victim of the murder, who turns out to be a total dickhead, was allowed to live. The murder victim deserved it, or Christie actually wants us to think that the victim deserved it, and the solution is to let everyone go free. Poirot knows the answer, and that's what matters to us, the audience, but it doesn't mean that this was the correct course of action. However, in Golden Age detective fiction, everything is about restoring order and allowing this man to live his life or continue to hurt people would be to continue to allow unbalance. And again, everything is about restoring balance. And by the end of the book, everything is restored, people go along their merry way, and Poirot sits there reconsidering his life choices. There's a great diversity in Golden Age detective fiction. However, these are 3 points that are basically universal across all of these famous writers and all of these famous detectives. Number 1, the world is balanced, and when it is unbalanced, the detective enters the scene and reintroduces order. Number 2, the respectable detective does their work out of love of justice, not for monetary gain. Number 3, good outweighs evil, and morality is crucial. Immorality will always be punished. Much like Holmes, Golden Age detectives are allowed to choose the punishment for the perpetrators of the criminal act. Unlike hard-boiled detectives, where that whole thing gets turned on its head, the point here is that in Golden Age detective fiction, the world is a bright, golden, sunny place full of good people, and the bad people are always punished, the good always prevails, and if there's ever any little bit of gray left over, that is possibly just the author trying to avoid certain tropes. However, the vast majority of these stories always end perfectly well wrapped with a little bow on top. Next week, we will look at hard-boiled detective stories. Just by the title, you can tell that hard-boiled isn't exactly going to be very similar to Golden Age detectives, and well, I guess prepare yourself for something a little bit more dark.